I'm Doug Boynton, and you're listening to WHRO's Weekly Edition, once again highlighting the week's news and stories happening in our area. Plenty to share with you this week as the midpoint of April is among us. WHRO spoke with the CEO of United Way of the Virginia Peninsula to talk about the impact that federal funding cuts have had on nonprofits. Here's a fun fact. Canadians make up the largest number of international visitors to Virginia, but will they continue to show up as the U.S.-Canada relationship remains strained? Also, Hampton Roads is one of the worst areas in the country for pollen. We'll hear from an environmental health professor to find out why. We'll get into these stories and more, but first, this news update from NPR. It's WHRO's Weekly Edition. Housing continues to be a big topic of discussion, in this case the affordable variety. And it turns out building more housing isn't enough to tackle the affordability crisis for those with lower incomes. That's just one of the messages from a wide-ranging discussion on the state of Virginia's housing from Tuesday's Hampton Roads Social Justice Conference at Christopher Newport University. WHRO's Ryan Murphy sat in on that conversation. He breaks it down for us.
Developers and some advocates argue the number one way to make housing cheaper is to build more of it. But leaving it to the for-profit market won't help those at the bottom of the economic ladder, says Ben Teresa.
We need a plan for the most vulnerable, and we need a plan for those who will not be served by this abundance agenda.
Teresa is a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University and founded RVA Eviction Lab, which studies evictions and other housing issues. He says there's no question there's a housing shortage, but that's just the starting point for a discussion on how to solve housing access problems. Ryan Murphy, WHRO News.
Restaurant owners in Williamsburg spoke out against a proposed increase in taxes on meals, lodging, and event tickets this week. WHRO's Nick McNamara has the details.
The proposal aligns with Hampton's tax rate stabilization policy, which uses a formula to recommend rate changes based on market conditions. If approved, the tax rate will decrease by a cent to $1.14 per $100 of assessed value. The proposed budget totals nearly $678 million, a more than 5% increase, cushioned by rising property values. While the tax rate could dip, storm and wastewater fees are projected to increase annually through 2030 to pay for higher costs, system repairs, and to meet new state regulations. Under the proposal, the average monthly residential stormwater bill will increase by $1, and the sewer bill will increase by more than $18. Nick McNamara, WHRO News.
The Great Bridge Battlefield and Waterways Museum in Chesapeake is one organization feeling the impact of the Trump administration's cuts at the Institute of Museum and Library Services. WHRO's Michelle Hankerson reports the agency provided local museums with grants to support new programs.
The Great Bridge Battlefield and Waterways Museum received $31,000 for a 2-year docent training program. Docents learned costumed interpretations, interpretive techniques, and successful ways to handle what museum leaders call difficult topics and situations. The museum's foundation says the trainings are done. Reimbursement was approved, but never sent. In a letter to the museum, acting director of the Institute of Museum and Library Services, Keith Sonderling, said the grant is no longer consistent with the agency's priorities and doesn't serve the interest of the United States. The Great Bridge Battlefield and Waterways Museum details the Revolutionary War Battle of Great Bridge. It opened in 2020. Michelle Hankerson, WHRO News.
Nonprofits in Hampton Roads are still assessing the impact of federal funding cuts on their ability to serve their communities. WHRO's Nick McNamara sat down with United Way of the Virginia Peninsula CEO, Charvela West, to discuss how her organization is finding ways for nonprofits and local funders to move forward.
As the federal government changes funding priorities and availability, What's the impact you've been seeing in the nonprofit world?
In any given year, hundreds of millions of dollars flow from the federal government, at some point reach the nonprofit community in the form of grants, usually. With the changes happening in federal agencies, we've begun already to see some of those funds be sunset for some organizations. Maybe they will finish out this grant cycle and it may not be available again. But mostly right now is a place of uncertainty. The nonprofit sector generally relies on all of us to support this work. But in the last decade or more, there's been a shift in which the government, local, state, and federal, have relied on nonprofits to provide services that maybe they were not ever intended to provide, but now we need. And so this is not a one-way street. We rely on those federal funds to continue doing that work, and our federal government relies on us to continue providing that care.
How much can local donors and businesses fill the gap of decreased federal dollars? How are nonprofits taking stock of their new needs?
Because of volatility in the market, uncertainty about our economic future, many have already started to decrease or have stated anticipated decreases in their philanthropic abilities. We're still collecting what that picture looks like. So we have a survey that we have invited human serving organizations, whether they're government or nonprofit, to complete, as well as local governments and funders, organizations that provide financial resources to do this work. Because I think while there are several national advocacy outlets, it's important to have a local focus. That's the work of each United Way, is to be hyper local. And so we can paint a picture of what's happening right here on the Virginia Peninsula in the nonprofit community. And what we're finding is right now there's a lot of anticipation. We're still gathering that. And then we have a community conversation scheduled for April 15th for all of these organizations to come together to add some context and color. And especially because everything is changing so rapidly between the time we put the survey out and the time we have a conversation, some of those responses may look a little different.
Do you expect counties and cities on the peninsula can step in and help?
We know that the extent of federal funding, should it be significantly depleted, cannot be made up by local resources. We've already seen our local governments come out with fairly conservative budgets, some talking tax increases already, and those are costs to the people that we serve. It's cyclical. The more that the cost of living increases from rent, which we've been talking about now for 5 or more years, the rapid increase in rent costs, food costs, as our federal workforce here on the Virginia Peninsula changes, that's going to impact our job market, salaries, and things like that. And so we expect that we'll continue to see the increase in need, but we don't expect to see the increase in funding to support that. And so while these changes are, dare I say, unprecedented, our response also has to be.
What are some early thoughts you have on how to respond to the funding challenges?
Where we have to find our critical points of progress are in ways we can better align to avoid duplication and overlap. You know, we say united is the way to a thriving community, and there's not a more urgent time to take that message and put it into action. Move nonprofits to working more closely together, to making our collaborative efforts more effective so that the resources that we do raise go further and have a deeper impact in the community. As opposed to spreading them wider, we can really hone in on outcome-based efforts that change the lives of the people we serve. And that collaboration doesn't just happen for those frontline direct service organizations. It also happens in the philanthropic community. How do we work together so that we're promoting that kind of collaboration and not inadvertently creating an environment that intensifies competition?
That was Shervela West, United Way of the Peninsula CEO. Still ahead on Weekly Edition, the new VA clinic in Chesapeake opened last week despite ongoing concerns about a lack of proper staffing. But first, North Carolina Governor Josh Stein recently announced that nearly 650,000 newly eligible North Carolinians have gained access to health care through Medicaid expansion. DJ Simmons with WFDD reports.
The announcement comes less than a year and a half after the state increased access to the program. Rebecca Cerise is with the North Carolina Justice Center. She says a combination of community advocates and the state finding innovative ways to reach people help produce results.
It has impacted all 100 counties, and in particular our rural counties, which, in some cases, some of our counties have over 50% of the population that are now enrolled in Medicaid.
But as House Republicans in Congress look for federal cuts to fund extended tax breaks, it's possible the program could take a hit. Cerise says reductions will be troubling and affect services.
We have a lot of people that rely on Medicaid for health coverage in the state. And so any kind of cuts or changes to the program would be detrimental and catastrophic to our state.
I'm DJ Simmons.
Some good news for Hampton residents. Property tax rates will fall for the fourth consecutive year. WHRO's Nick McNamara digs into the proposed 2026 budget.
Restaurant owners are worried upping taxes on their customers will drive them to eat out of town, putting their establishments out of business.
I never prior to COVID worried about sales. I worried about supporting the restaurant and doing the service. Now I am worried about sales on a daily basis. We're being hit with this tariff. The food chain is attacking us. We're being attacked from every angle there is, taking our margins away.
That's Kashawn on second owner Neil Griggs. City Manager Andrew Trivett says the increased meals, lodging, and new ticket tax, coupled with decreasing some spending and cutting projects, would ensure Williamsburg can cover operations and keep its capital improvements fund out of the red. City administration lowered the proposed tax increase to 1.5% on meals and 2% on lodging, among other changes. Mayor Doug Pond says they'll continue to look for cuts before the budget vote in May. Nick McNamara, WHRO News.
Virginia loves Canadian visitors, who comprise the largest group of international travelers to the state. But as WHRO's Sienna Morales reports, it's not clear if they still love us.
Canadian travel to the U.S. might drop off as tensions grow between the two countries. Local tourism professionals say it's too soon to tell how that will impact Virginia. According to the Convention and Visitors Bureau, 2 groups canceled visits to Virginia Beach in April. And at the end of the month, one of 2 Canadian bands dropped out of the International Tattoo. Economic factors also influence travel.
If things are happening that cause people to fear anything that may affect their financial stability, one of the things that they'll look at is travel. Do I need to take that vacation? Do I need to take that trip?
That's Chris Jones, a spokesperson for Norfolk International Airport. After President Donald Trump levied tariffs, Canadian leaders urged their folks to spend time and money closer to home. Sienna Morales, WHRO News.
President Donald Trump was popular with military veterans in last year's election. According to an Edison Research exit poll, 64% of them voted for Trump, compared to 34% who voted for Vice President Kamala Harris. But now some veterans are protesting as the Trump administration sharply cuts the Department of Veterans Affairs. Andrew Dyer reports for the American Homefront Project.
Stop the cuts. Protect our veterans.
On a rainy Friday afternoon in San Diego, dozens of veterans gathered to protest planned cuts to the VA. It's one of several such protests that have been held around the country. It's here that I meet Cliff DeWolf, who served 20 years in the Navy. He was wounded in combat and receives disability benefits from the VA.
We need counseling services. We need other services, but they're slashing jobs left and right. That's why I'm here.
San Diego is a military town with major Navy and Marine Corps bases throughout the county. More than 100,000 active duty service members live here, plus about 200,000 veterans. There's a large VA medical center and several satellite clinics around the county. VA San Diego says it serves about 150,000 veterans in the region. The protests were organized after VA Secretary Doug Collins told veterans in a March video to get used to the changes.
It's extraordinarily difficult for me, especially as a VA leader, and your secretary to make these types of decisions. But the federal government does not exist to employ people. It exists to serve people.
Members of the Don Diego VFW Hall also came to the protest. The VFW Hall is in the historic Latino neighborhood of Logan Heights. Every Thursday, it opens its doors to the community and serves free breakfast. The day I visited, most of the veterans at the hall weren't up to talking about politics. The stated goal at the VA is to fire 70 to 80,000 people and to bring the department to its 2019 staffing level. But 2019 was before Congress passed the PACT Act, which opened VA benefits to millions more veterans. To accommodate that added demand, the agency beefed up staffing. Marine veteran Sarah Check says she relies on the VA, and the move to cut staff left her feeling betrayed.
You know, that's the way everyone is feeling right now. It's not only me, but a sense of betrayal and a sense of betrayal from our country.
Check co-chairs the Veteran and Veteran Family Committee in California for the Forward Party. That's a startup centrist political party started a few years ago by former Democratic presidential candidate and billionaire Andrew Yang.
I believe that we're starting to see the breakdown of the two-party system actively before our eyes every day. And there's a problem when Americans, by and large, are saying, not just veterans, but Americans in general, that the political system is causing them stress and anxiety every day in their lives. That's a problem.
VA Medical Center in San Diego won't respond to questions about how extensive the cuts are locally. In San Diego, I'm Andrew Dyer.
VA Secretary Doug Collins opened the new VA clinic in Chesapeake last week amid controversy over the number of staff. WHRO military reporter Steve Walsh covered that story.
Secretary Collins cut the ribbon on the new VA facility on North Battlefield in Chesapeake Thursday afternoon. Afterwards, he addressed why the facility is opening next week with only 150 of the expected 550 staffers.
Have y'all been to a restaurant lately that did a cold opening? All of them do. Most places will do an issue where they'll open it up, make sure they got the stuff in place. The VA is no different.
He says the federal hiring freeze had no impact and that the facility was scheduled to open in phases, though VA documents say it was scheduled to open with at least double the number of staff. Dental care will now open in July. This area is the 10th fastest growing region for the VA. Steve Walsh, WHRO News.
Suffolk Public Schools Administration is uncertain and concerned about the fallout of the potential closing of the U.S. Department of Education. WHRO's Nick McNamara with that story.
Superintendent John Gordon says there are many unknowns for schools should the federal government eliminate the department. He told Suffolk City Council this week it would be difficult to make up the more than $9.5 million in federal support if it is cut.
The only contingency plan that we may have to come back to is to beg and ask you all for an additional $10 million, but we're hoping that it doesn't get to that point.
The White House says funding required by law will continue. Special education and federal student loan programs could move to the Departments of Health and Human Services and the Small Business Administration. But Gordon says their points of contact in the Education Department have been laid off. Nick McNamara, WHRO News.
Suffolk School Board members last week questioned how quickly new police officers for elementary schools can be hired. WHRO's Nick McNamara covered that story too.
Suffolk's proposed budget includes $5.8 million more than last year for schools and pays for 4 of the 11 school resource officers the division requested in 2026. During a joint meeting, board member Kimberly Slingluff asked about the timeline for hiring the other officers.
That was one of the top initiatives that I was pushing for was SROs in all of our schools.
Mayor Mike Duman says it's not a matter of money, but recruits, as departments nationwide face hiring shortages.
The reality of it is it would be difficult to find 11 bodies.
The city is also changing how it accounts for school officers, paying new and current staff out of its budget, and no longer asking the schools to reimburse the cost. Duman says that will put the division's budget ahead by about $200,000 in 2026. Nick McNamara, WHRO News.
We should mention for both of those stories, Suffolk Public Schools is a member of HRETA, which holds the license to the WHRO stations. The Asthma and Allergy Foundation of America recently listed Hampton Roads as one of the nation's worst areas for pollen allergies. Jim Blando teaches environmental health at Old Dominion University, and he spoke with WHRO's Catherine Hafner about why our area is so sneezy.
This recent report rated the wider Virginia Beach area as number 11 on the list of U.S. allergy capitals. What did you think when you saw that?
My first thought was not surprising at all. Here, we have several characteristics that are very interesting. One of the major ones being that it's warm and we have a lot of moisture. We're surrounded by a lot of water, tend to get storms coming off the ocean that can dump a lot of water in the area, result in flooding. The more moisture and the more warmth that you have, the more growth you're going to have. If you have structures with leaky roofs and those sorts of things, they get wet and they start growing mold. Plants and vegetation will grow more and produce more pollen as a result of that. Because of where we're located, we have a really interesting variety of plants and things that will grow here, northern plants and southern plants. So the consequence of that is you have a tremendous variety of plants that bloom all different times of year, produce lots of different types of pollen. Add on top of that we're a pretty populated area, lots of aerosols that are generated from traffic and other things. The combination oftentimes can result in more severe reactions to allergies and those sorts of things.
And then I understand climate change is also expected to make things worse. Why and how is that?
Overall warming of the global mean temperature generally has resulted in longer pollen seasons. So plants start blooming earlier, they start producing pollen earlier, and they produce it for longer. Plants will also tend to produce more pollen. Some of the studies that USDA has done and others have shown that the actual allergen content is actually increasing with increasing temperatures, especially increasing temperatures at night. As a result of that, people's exposure is not only increasing in quantity, but it's also increasing in length of time, which means people are likely to experience a longer period of allergic symptoms. One of the big impacts that sea level rise will have is it will cause areas to get flooded that maybe weren't getting flooded routinely. You're going to have more moisture, more mold, more plant growth. When you have more extreme rainfall, you have the same amount of moisture in a much shorter period of time. It's really that complex interplay between the seasons, the amount of moisture, what the weather patterns are, and climate change is impacting all of that.
I think people sometimes think of allergies as a nuisance, and they are, but what are some of the longer-term health impacts of allergy exposure?
One of the things that allergies will do is it'll certainly prime your immune system. And there are some people that tend to have more of an inflammatory response than others. People that have things like eczema, psoriasis, allergic asthma, you'll find that they tend to have a stronger pro-inflammatory response when they're exposed to things, especially things that are allergenic like pollens and mold spores. The short-term consequence is that you're more likely to have an allergic reaction that will precipitate an asthma attack. And anybody that has asthma could certainly tell you that it's not a pleasant experience and can be really problematic and results in hospitalizations. People that are exposed to pollutants and allergens together are more likely to have a more severe respiratory infection. Now, the long-term consequences is that when people have this sort of pro-inflammatory response, certain aspects of your biological response will result in inflammation, and chronic inflammation over a long period of time could be associated potentially with other adverse conditions, like, for example, having their respiratory function gradually decrease over time.
So what can people do to protect themselves?
Certainly, people should visit with their healthcare provider. For some environmental controls, a few things that are beneficial is, for example, in-home air cleaners, especially HEPA filters. Studies have shown that, in fact, your typical filtration system can have a very positive impact on lowering the concentration of pollens and other particles in the home. Think about what kind of plants you put inside the home. You walk around on your lawn and your shoes are covered in pollen. If you take your shoes off before you walk around your house, so you don't spread it all around your house, kind of thing. If you're cutting the grass or doing yard work and cutting up plants and pruning and doing those things, maybe change your clothes before you start sitting around on the furniture in your home. Of course, we have to live in the real world. Nobody lives in a bubble. So you're certainly not going to get away from pollens and molds because they're ubiquitous in the environment. Whatever is practically possible.
You've been listening to WHRO's Weekly Edition. We had help today from WHRO's Steve Walsh, Catherine Hafner, Nick McNamara, Michelle Hankerson, Sienna Morales, and Ryan Murphy, WFDD's DJ Simmons, and Andrew Dyer with the American Homefront Project. Also, thanks as always to Connor Worley, who produced today's show. A reminder, you can always catch full episodes on the Weekly Edition podcast feed, and you can get your news updates at WHRO.org, the WHRO smartphone app, and the WHRO Reports podcast feed. For all of us at WHRO and WHRV, I'm Doug Boynton. Stay safe. Be well.